Tens of thousands of car dealerships across the country currently have their showroom windows blacked out with heavy paper. Armed guards are literally standing by the delivery trucks. We are at the absolute climax of a massively secretive 10-year corporate operation, and the anticipation, it's at an absolute fever pitch.
The date is September 4th, 1957. Ford internally calls it E-Day. They've just dumped $400 million mid-century dollars and an entire decade of planning into unveiling what is breathlessly hyped as the most expertly engineered, highly anticipated new car of the post-war age. I mean, they've got Bing Crosby hosting a massive CBS television special for it. This is the launch to end all launches.
And yet, $250 million. That is the staggering, unprecedented financial loss Ford absorbed in less than 3 years. Almost overnight, this meticulously researched machine became a dictionary-level synonym for spectacular commercial failure. A flop so profound it's still dissected today.
So how does a company with virtually limitless resources get at this spectacularly wrong? Well, we have to look at the exact void they were desperately trying to fill. Back in the 1950s, General Motors was just eating Ford's lunch. GM had this brilliant ascending 5-tier strategy. You start out with a Chevy, right? Then you move up to a Pontiac, an Oldsmobile, a Buick, and finally, you've made it to a Cadillac. Ford, on the other hand, had a massive, glaring gap in their lineup. They had Ford at the bottom, Mercury in the middle, and then all the way up to Lincoln at the top. They were bleeding market share because they desperately needed something in that upper middle market, a space totally dominated by Oldsmobile and Buick. Enter a highly secretive 1955 initiative led by executive Louis Crusoe. Internally, they called it Project E. They actually set up a completely separate, heavily guarded division at Ford headquarters in Dearborn just to build this gap-filling wonder car.
And listen, they didn't just guess what the public wanted. They commissioned a staggering amount of consumer research from outside firms and ran hundreds of focus groups. The sheer scale of this data-driven market research was entirely unprecedented for the time. They were just throwing money at the data, absolutely determined to ensure this new mid-price brand would be flawlessly tailored to the 1950s consumer.
But here is where things take a seriously bizarre turn. Amidst all this rigid, data-driven corporate secrecy, Ford famously went out and hired Pulitzer Prize-winning poet Marianne Moore to come up with a name. And she gave them these incredibly absurd artistic suggestions. Are you ready for this? Utopian, Turtletop, and Pastelogram. Yeah. Unsurprisingly, the executives quietly set those aside. So what name did they actually go with? They chose Edsel, named for Edsel Ford, the only son of company founder Henry Ford, who had died back in 1943. So they ignored the poets, and actually, they even ignored the founder's grandson, Henry Ford II, who argued the name was just plain undignified. But the board forced it through anyway as an act of family veneration. So 10 years of planning, endless focus groups, and a rejected Utopian Turtletop later, the marketing hype finally collides with reality. It's E-Day. The heavy paper comes off those showroom windows. The chief designer, Roy Brown Jr., had been handed a pretty intense mandate. Create a distinctive face that is instantly recognizable from all the way across a parking lot. His solution? A vertical oval grille positioned exactly between two horizontal headlight clusters. It looked like absolutely nothing else on the road. And man, the styling was violently polarizing. The press absolutely roasted it. They mercilessly compared that vertical grille to a horse collar, a toilet seat, and finally this legendary quip, they said it looked like an Oldsmobile sucking on a lemon. But the design choices get even stranger. Check out the Teletouch transmission. Ford wanted the car to feel super futuristic, right? So they put the push-button automatic transmission selectors directly in the center of the steering wheel hub. Do you see the problem there? That is exactly where the horn usually is. Drivers were trying to honk at traffic and accidentally throwing their cars into reverse at 30 miles an hour. All of this built into an absolute collapse. Ford's projected break-even point for the first year was 200,000 units. Instead, actual 1958 sales were a dismal 63,000. And by 1959, it dropped even further to just 45,000. That breathlessly hyped Bing Crosby TV launch crashed into these abysmal figures almost instantly. So $400 million spent in development, and the sales are just falling completely off a cliff. Why did the numbers plummet so severely? Well, it was an inescapable death spiral, and a corporate autopsy reveals exactly why. First, terrible timing.
The US laid into a sharp recession right as the car launched in August 1957. Second, post-Sputnik austerity. The Soviet satellite launched in October, stoking this national mood that suddenly favored smaller, economical cars over giant, flashy luxury cruisers. Third, obviously, that violently polarizing, lemon-sucking Grille. Fourth, the Teletouch transmission introduced massive electrical failures and quality control issues from a rushed production line. And finally, an unclear brand identity. The car was priced way too high and simply wasn't distinct enough from Mercury to justify its own existence. The finality was brutal. On November 19, 1959, just 2 years after that massive launch, Ford pulled the plug completely. Production ceased immediately. Across all 3 model years, they sold fewer than 120,000 total cars. They failed to meet even their first-year target alone. So the factories retooled, the massive financial losses were absorbed, and the Edsel took its permanent place in the dictionary right under the word flop. But the story actually takes one final, incredibly strange turn.
The ultimate vindication arrived decades later. Roy Brown Jr., the designer who endured years of being publicly mocked for creating the most ridiculed car in modern history, actually lived long enough to see his polarizing work completely reevaluated. Today, that infamous horse-collar grille isn't seen as a failure at all, but rather as a charming, highly distinctive emblem of mid-century industrial design optimism.
Which leaves us with this. A project that did everything right by the data, spent wildly on research, and still crashed spectacularly. So why does a car the public decisively, overwhelmingly rejected, complete with its lemon-sucking grille, now command an absolute fortune on the vintage auction block?